Hey guys, imagine you're huddled in a mud-splattered trench under a sky the color of bruised bruisers, the clang of metal echoing like a bad ringtone, while a pungent mix of horse, sweat, and roasted boar gnaws at your nostrils. Yeah, that's a typical Roman front line, and every legionary clutches a tiny, rib-shaped bone in his gauntlet for luck, because nothing says, "I'll survive this mess," like a pocket-sized reminder that even the dead can be on your side. Before we dig deeper, smash that like button if you love bizarre history hacks, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because I'm genuinely curious if you've ever carried a superstition in your pocket. Now dim the lights, grab a coffee or a goblet, and settle in so the scent of ancient leather and ash feels almost tangible. Because we're about to unpack why a little femur fragment became the original good luck charm for soldiers who thought marching in formation was a full-time cardio class. You'll hear how the Romans turned a stray animal's bone into a portable morale boost, blending grim practicality with a dash of dark humor that would make today's good vibes. Only memes look like a polite postcard. Think about it. If you ever wonder why we still keep lucky charms on our keychains, the answer might just be a 2,000-year-old practice that smelled like victory and a little bit of rot. At first light, the camp stirred like a slow tide, the pale sky slipping over the hillocks that cradled the legion's tents. Marcus, a centurion whose voice had the texture of worn leather, gathered his cohort beneath the rising sun and slipped a tiny animal bone into the seam of his larica. He spoke of the early republic, when hunters tucked such relics into their belts as a whisper of protection against the wood's unseen dangers. The bone was small enough to fit between the metal strips, yet its presence felt palpable, a quiet counterweight to the clamor of armor. The men listened, eyes half closed, the scent of damp earth mingling with the faint metallic tang of steel, and each one felt the subtle weight of tradition settle onto their shoulders. Soon the column moved, the march rhythm a steady thump of sandals on packed earth, the distant hills echoing with the low murmur of unseen streams. A cold wind brushed the backs of the soldiers, stirring the dust and carrying a faint, uneasy rustle from the forest beyond, as if the trees themselves held their breath. Marcus felt the tension in the line, the way the bone pressed gently against his chest, a reminder that even the strongest shield could be pierced by superstition. He glanced at his men, noticing a slight tightening of fists and the way some fingers lingered on the fabric that concealed the hidden token. The day stretched ahead, a thin ribbon of light threading through the shadows of uncertainty. In a moment of quiet irony, a younger legionary named Gaius whispered that the bone was no more powerful than a piece of broken pottery. Yet he smiled as he adjusted the strap of his belt. The contrast between the grand ambitions of conquest and the modestness of a tiny femur brought a soft chuckle to the air, like a moth's wing against a stone wall. Marcus watched the scene, noting how the men, hardened by battle, still sought comfort in the smallest of objects, as if the universe permitted a modest grace. The sun climbed higher, casting long, warm shadows that flattened the landscape, making the camp appear as a simple rectangle of muted colors against the horizon. The irony settled like a gentle fog, unnoticed but present, wrapping the cohort in a shared, unspoken amusement. Night fell with a hush that settled over the camp like a thin blanket. The crackle of the fire, the only sound breaking the darkness. Soldiers reclined on their blankets, the leather of their armor cool against the night air, each feeling the faint, steady pressure of the bone tucked within. The glow of ember light illuminated the soft creases of their faces, eyes half closed, breaths forming small clouds that rose and vanished. In that stillness, the bone seemed less a talisman and more a reminder of the ordinary moments that stitched lives together, shared meals, whispered stories, the simple act of holding one's breath before sleep. The calm lingered, a subtle reassurance that even in the vast sweep of history, the smallest details could hold a quiet steadiness. When the campaign finally waned, and the legion returned to the familiar stone of the city, the bones remained hidden in the folds of their armor, their purpose now a soft echo of the past. Marcus reflected on how the practice had survived wars and seasons, a fragile thread linking soldiers to the hunters of ancient roads. He realized that the tiny bone was less about divine favor and more about human need to clutch something tangible when the future stretched vague and distant. The men dispersed, each carrying the quiet weight of that reminder as they stepped back into bustling streets, the subtle scent of leather and ash clinging to their coats. In the end, the practice lingered like a gentle sigh, a modest testament to the enduring human desire for simple, unseen comfort. Marcus, a veteran centurion whose hands are still stained with the dust of the camp, gathers the new cohort around the flickering fire of the evening watch. He points to a small, polished femur, the bone of a wolf that once prowled the banks of the Tiber, and tells them how that fragment steadied a legion when the river threatened to swallow their march. The water had risen that summer, cold and relentless, and the soldiers, cramped in soaked cuirasses, felt the tide dragging their resolve. According to the old story, a lone wolf had dragged the bone from the marsh and placed it upon the commander's shield, and the river suddenly calmed as if recognizing the relic. The bone was then wrapped in leather and kept in a leather satchel, a quiet talisman whispered about in the columns of the camp. That night, the Legion prepared to cross the swollen Tiber at dawn. The cold mist rising from the water like breath from the earth. Each legionary tightened his greaves, the clink of metal echoing against the distant murmur of the river, while the wolf bone rested in the pocket of the standard-bearer. Its weight a muted reminder, new recruits, faces still soft from the camp's recent rains, whispered doubts, their eyes flicking to the slick stones, and wondering if luck could be held in a fragment of marrow. The centurions paced, the sand under their sandals shifting, and the scent of wet earth grew stronger, pressing on the nerves of the men. As the first step onto the makeshift bridge was taken, a sudden splash startled the line, and the bone was knocked free, spinning briefly in the air before landing with a dull thud against a soldier's shield. The bone, now lying against the battered shield, seemed absurdly out of place amid the disciplined march, its ivory hue reflecting the weak sunrise. A younger soldier, his voice tentative, asked why they clung to a relic when steel and training should suffice, his question hanging like a thin thread over the river's roar. An older centurion chuckled, the sound dry as parchment, and replied that even the most steadfast footfall can benefit from a whisper of tradition, a small concession to the unknown. As the Legion pressed forward, a sudden gust sent a spray of water up the bridge, soaking the woolen tunics and making the bone glisten as if embarrassed. The moment passed without incident, yet the men could not help noticing how the ritual's simplicity contrasted with the monumental effort of crossing a flood. When the last foot cleared the riverbank, the soldiers gathered near a low stone altar, the evening shadows lengthening across the camp's walls. Marcus produced a small flask of olive oil and a cracked amphora of wine, pouring the amber liquid over the bone in slow, deliberate streams that caught the fading light. The oil warmed the surface, the wine tinged it with a faint crimson, and the scent of fermented grapes mingled with the earthy aroma of the damp ground, creating a quiet ceremony that seemed to soothe the collective breath. The men watched the bone absorb the fluids, the surface turning glossy, while the distant clatter of campfires settled into a soft hum. In that stillness, the Legion felt a shared relief, as if the river's threat had been absorbed alongside the bone's cleansing. Later, as the camp settled into the low murmur of night, Marcus sat alone on the parapet, the wolf bone tucked into his satchel, its smooth edge pressed against his palm. He thought of the river's roar, and how it had seemed monstrous until the soldiers' steps turned the flood into a passage, a reminder that fear often wears a familiar guise. The younger men, now quiet, would speak of the bone in hushed tones, perhaps more for the comfort of shared story than for any true power it held. Yet the ritual persisted, a modest anchor in a world where empire rose and fell like the tide. In the gentle darkness, Marcus felt a soft gratitude for the small absurdities that kept the Legion moving forward, a quiet acknowledgement that even the most disciplined foot may need a humble token to steady its stride. The Legio marched eastward, the clang of lorikeet echoing against the pale limestone of the Alpine foothills. Each legionary tucked a small animal bone smooth, ivory-colored, worn by the palm, into the strap of his caligy as a quiet promise of safety. The sky was a thin gray, the cold wind brushing the exposed backs of the men as they stepped over snow-capped stones. Their pace was measured, the commander's voice a low cadence that blended with the distant rush of a thawing stream. In this steady rhythm, the tiny talismans felt like ordinary trinkets, barely noticed among the weight of packs and shields. By midday, the weather turned, a sudden gale whipping the pass into a blinding swirl of white. The cohort split as the path forked around a jagged outcrop, and the shouts of men carried only as muffled echoes. When the storm settled, the youngest soldier, Lucius, discovered his bone missing from the leather thong that had always held it. A tight knot formed in the ribs of his comrades, their breaths shallow as the cold settled deeper into their cloaks. Whispers rose, not of strategy, but of the mountain's displeasure, and the absence of the talisman seemed to echo louder than any marching drum. Yet as the wind died, a veteran centurion lifted a steaming cup of broth and chuckled, noting that the bone was likely a discarded morsel from the night's rations. He placed his own talisman on the ground, a quiet gesture that turned the missing piece into a shared joke about superstition and hunger. The men glanced at each other, smiles thin under frost, and the tension softened like ice cracking under a gentle sun. The blurred silhouettes of distant mountain spirits lingered in the mist, unseen and indifferent to the soldiers' small anxieties. In that moment, the irony of fearing a simple rib fragment became a reminder that the world continued its indifferent march, regardless of human charms. The Legion found a shallow cave, its stone walls holding a faint, dry heat that kept the fire's orange glow from flickering too wildly. They settled onto furs and wooden benches, the crackle of flames filling the silence that had followed the storm. Hands passed around a shared loaf, and the missing bone was spoken of no more than a forgotten snack, its absence unnoticed beside the steady rhythm of chewing. The night air brushed the faces of the soldiers, each breath forming a small cloud that rose and faded into the darkness. Within this modest shelter, the men's thoughts drifted back to the march ahead, their steps measured not by omens, but by the steady beat of their own hearts. At sunrise, the cohort regrouped, the path ahead still steep, the snow glittering like distant shards of glass. Lucius slipped his hand into his boot, feeling the empty space where the bone had rested, and realized that luck had lingered in the warmth of comrades rather than in a hollow relic. The legion moved forward, the soft echo of their sandals, a reminder that survival was built more on shared resolve than on silent charms. The mountains, indifferent and enduring, watched their progress with a hidden, shadowed face that never revealed judgment. In the quiet after the climb, the story of a lost bone settled into the larger tapestry of human habit, an anecdote of how small gestures can both comfort and perplex, yet ultimately fade beneath the steady march of time. At dawn, the camp beyond Alicia's outer wall lay in a thin veil of mist, the wooden palisades still echoing the soft crackle of a waking fire. Legionaries adjusted their lorikeet, while their fingers brushed the smooth, thumb-sized bone tucked into a leather strap, a habit learned from fathers who whispered of luck without naming any god. The bone, pale as dried riverbed driftwood, warmed gradually in the rising sun, and Marcus felt its weight like a quiet reminder of the days before the siege. Around them, the distant hum of Vercingetorix's forces lingered, a low thrum that blended with the occasional clink of armor. In the half-light, the soldiers exchanged brief nods, their faces calm, the bone a small, unspoken promise of safety. When the enemy's catapults loosed their first stones, the air filled with a harsh, grinding roar as granite shattered the outer defenses, sending splinters of stone raining onto the dusty ground. The sudden breach opened a jagged gap, and the clang of steel against steel rose as legionaries hurried to the breach, their shields trembling in the wind. Amid the shuffling feet and dust, Marcus felt a cold slip from his hand and saw his bone tumble from his strap, landing with a soft thud among the rubble. For a heartbeat, the chaos seemed to pause, as the tiny relic caught a stray sunbeam flashing amber against the gray debris. The sight of the familiar token, misplaced yet found, sparked a quiet lift in the men's spirits, drawing a shallow, collective breath before they surged forward. The bone's appearance felt almost absurd, a tiny, inert piece against the roar of war. Yet the soldiers could not suppress a low chuckle that brushed the tension like a gentle wind. A veteran whispered that the luck of a bone could outmatch the might of a catapult, and the irony hung in the smoky air, softening the edge of fear. As they formed a line, the bone was held aloft for a moment, its pale surface reflecting the dimming sky, a mute talisman that seemed to mock the enemy's grand machines. The irony lay not in the bone's power, but in how such a modest object could become a rallying point, turning the grinding fatigue of siege into a brief, shared smile. With that subtle humor buoying their steps, the legion charged, the clatter of their march now a quieter, purposeful rhythm. When the last of the enemy's soldiers fell back into the dusk, a hushed stillness settled over the courtyard, broken only by the crackle of a dying fire and the soft sigh of exhausted breath. The men gathered around a low wooden table, passing coarse bread and thin cheese, the bone now placed reverently on a smooth stone as if it were a tiny altar. Warmth from the embers brushed against their tired skin, and the faint scent of smoked meat mingled with the lingering iron of blood. In that calm, the armor clanked less, the helmets were set aside, and the soldiers' eyes drifted to the simple relic. Its presence, a gentle reminder of the fragile hope that had carried them through. The night deepened, and the camp settled into a quiet rhythm, each heartbeat matching the slow pulse of the distant river. Later chroniclers would note the bone among the spoils, recording its role not as a divine sign, but as a human curiosity that survived the clash of steel. The practice of tucking small bones into belts endured, a quiet tradition that whispered of the need for tangible comfort amid uncertainty. As the empire expanded, the ritual spread, each soldier's private token reflecting a broader truth. Even in grand campaigns, the smallest objects can bear the weight of collective resolve. The memory of that night at Alesia lingered like a faint echo in marble halls, reminding future generations that war is as much about ordinary hands as it is about grand strategies. In the end, the bone rested back in the earth, its story carried forward by the soft voices of those who remembered, a modest testament to human imperfection and quiet perseverance. When the legions marched across the hot, dust-laden plain of Germania, a young centurion slipped a tiny animal femur into his leather pouch, the bone smoothed by river water and the heat of campfires. The discovery was quiet, a faint click as the bone brushed against the rusted metal of his belt, unnoticed by the clamor of marching boots and distant horns. He kept it close, feeling the chill of the bone against his palm during the night watches, as if the small relic could hold back the cold wind that whispered over the marshes. Around the fire, the men traded stories of omens, and the centurion offered his tiny token as a modest counter-charm. The bone rested in the dim light, its surface gleaming with a muted ivory that seemed to absorb the flickering shadows. The next dawn brought a sudden thunder of steel, as enemy spears broke the thin line of the legionary shield wall, and the air filled with the metallic taste of blood and sweat. Soldiers gripped their gladii tighter, their breath shallow, while the centurion's hand found the bone instinctively, its smoothness a brief pause amid the panic. Each clash sent echoes against the pine forest, the sound of swords striking armor like distant rain on stone. The bone, cool to the touch, reminded the centurion of the river that had once polished it, a small reassurance that steadied his gaze. Though the battle raged, the tiny relic never left his side, its presence a silent promise amid the chaos. When the sun finally slipped behind the jagged hills, the legion emerged bruised but victorious, the enemy retreating like a tide pulling away from the shore. The centurion slipped the bone from his pouch and pressed it against his chest, feeling the faint thud of his own heartbeat as if the relic shared its rhythm. The men laughed softly, sharing wine from cracked amphorae, joking about luck as if it were a candle flickering in a draught. Yet the bone, now rested on the ground beside a cracked shield, seemed no more potent than a pebble, its luck indistinguishable from the sweat on their brows. The irony lingered. A simple fragment of bone had survived the clash, yet it offered no guarantee beyond the shared moment of relief. The march back to Rome unfolded under a sky painted in muted orange, the soldiers' sandals clacking on the worn stone of the Via Appia, the warmth of the road seeping through their sandals. In the evenings, the centurion placed the bone on a wooden table among maps and a bowl of olives, its surface catching the soft glow of lanterns. Conversations drifted from the day's march to the comfort of home, and the bone became a quiet topic, passed from hand to hand like a well-worn coin. By the time the legion entered the city gates, the tiny relic had gathered a reputation, whispered among the ranks as a symbol of survival rather than a magical charm. The stone-cold bone rested against the marble steps of the forum, unnoticed by the bustling crowds, yet holding a place in the soldiers' collective memory. In the years that followed, new recruits were given similarly small bones, each an unadorned token presented by seasoned veterans who recalled the subtle steadiness it had provided. The practice spread quietly through the legions, turning into a modest tradition that lingered long after the original bone was long since buried beneath the soil of distant camps. Historians later noted the pattern, describing it as a testament to how the smallest objects can anchor human hope amid the vast machinery of war. The bone, now a faded legend, reminded the empire that even the most modest relic can linger in the mind like a soft echo after a distant drum. As the sun set over the marble roofs of Rome, the story of the little bone rested in the quiet of archives, a calm reminder of humanity's gentle search for certainty. In the dry heat of summer AD 117, Centurion Marcus Valerius led his battered cohort back to the stone-walled camp at Vindonissa, the air heavy with dust, and the faint smell of cooked pork. The legionaries moved in a measured cadence, their iron larica clanking softly against the warm sand that still clung to their boots. Around the perimeter, the walls rose like tired sentinels, their shadows lengthening as the sun slipped toward evening. Marcus paused at the gate, his hand resting on the rough surface of a wooden pallet where a small bronze amulet of the goddess Bellona lay, its face forever hidden by a veil of shadow. The men gathered around him, eyes half closed, each holding a tiny lead talisman of Mars, as if the metal itself could carry the weight of their hopes. Night fell slowly, and the camp's central fire crackled, sending sparks that danced over the worn faces of the soldiers. A low murmur rose as the legionaries whispered about the upcoming march toward the distant hills, their voices mingling with the rustle of leather straps and the occasional clink of metal against metal. The bronze amulet glinted faintly in the firelight, its surface warm to the touch, while the lead talismans rested heavy in calloused palms, each small disc pressed against a ribcage as a quiet promise of protection. Somewhere beyond the walls, the distant river murmured, a reminder that the world beyond the camp was both vast and indifferent. The centurion watched the flickering flames, feeling the tension of an unseen future pressing against the thin veil of routine. When dawn painted the sky with a pale ochre, the cohort slipped out of the camp in a line as orderly as the rows of bricks behind them, their steps measured against the soft earth. The irony of men clad in unyielding iron, yet clutching fragile charms, was not lost on the quiet observers who noted how the bronze bell of Bellona swayed with each stride, as if the goddess herself were a nervous companion. A few soldiers chuckled low, aware that the clatter of their armor announced their presence louder than any spoken prayer could. The lead talismans slipped against the soldiers' chests, producing a faint, almost imperceptible thud that blended with the distant cry of a hawk. Yet the march continued, a gentle rhythm that seemed to mock the very notion of fear, while the amulets whispered their silent oath against the sunrise. The battlefield unfolded as a muted tapestry of grass, stone, and the occasional glint of distant armor, all bathed in the soft, amber light of late morning. Soldiers crouched behind low walls, the sound of their breathing steady, their eyes scanning the horizon while the bronze charms rested against their necks, cool to the skin despite the lingering heat. The lead talismans, tucked beneath their shields, made a subtle, reassuring vibration with each heartbeat, a quiet reminder of the unseen weight they chose to bear. Around them, the wind rustled through dried reeds, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the distant murmur of another legion's distant shouts. In that stillness, the clinking of metal seemed to mark time like a slow metronome, and the men moved with a calm that bordered on the ordinary, as if the day itself were a paused film. When the sun slipped low, the soldiers returned to Vindanissa, their armor dulled by dust, and their faces marked by the quiet fatigue of duty. The bronze amulet of Bellona lay again on the wooden pallet, its surface now bearing a faint patina from the day's heat, while the lead talismans were set beside it, each bearing the soft imprint of a hand that had held it through fear and hope alike. Marcus stood beneath the stone arches, feeling the cool evening breeze brush against his cheek, and he thought of the countless soldiers before him who had trusted similar charms. The camp settled into a low hum of conversation, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional clink of a cup against a wooden table. Each sound a reminder of human imperfection, wrapped in ritual. In the lingering quiet, the legionaries understood, without words, that the true protection lay not in metal or myth, but in the shared stillness that followed every storm. At the break of dawn, the Danube camp stirred with the muted clang of Gaius' forge, where iron sang against anvil, and sweat glistened on forearms. Legionaries moved in measured rows, their sandals leaving faint prints on the packed earth, while the scent of heated metal mingled with the river's cool mist. Gaius slipped a thin copper disc into a leather pouch, polishing it until the surface caught a soft, amber glow. He whispered a practical blessing, more of a routine than a prayer, into the quiet, his words lost in the routine hum of hammering. The men accepted the charms with a polite nod, their eyes briefly meeting the tiny talismans before returning to the tasks of breakfast and gear. Later, as the cohort prepared to march, Lucius, a recent recruit, slipped his newly forged amulet from his belt and discovered a hairline crack that caught the morning light. A low murmur rippled through the ranks, the crack seeming to echo like a thin sigh across the ranks, and some veterans recalled old tales of broken charms inviting misfortune. The sergeant, used to discipline over superstition, walked past with a measured stride, his sandals sounding steady against the stone. Yet his eyes lingered a moment on the fractured talisman. Whispers grew into a subdued chatter, each soldier tightening their grip on shields, as if the crack might summon a phantom wind. The tension settled like a thin fog, thin enough to be ignored, yet heavy enough to be felt. When the campfire burned low that evening, Gaius pulled the cracked amulet from his satchel, and with a half smile, set it beside a fresh, unblemished piece, letting the flames lick its edges. He offered a dry comment about the iron's resilience, noting that even a cracked charm could still protect the metal beneath. A quiet irony that drew a soft chuckle from the nearby soldiers. The humor, gentle as the smoke curling upward, eased the nervous energy, and the men found themselves sharing small jokes about the battlefield's rumored hauntings. Their laughter, low and steady, blended with the crackle of wood, turning the earlier anxiety into a shared, almost theatrical anecdote. In the dim light, the amulets lay side by side, a simple reminder that belief and practicality often walk hand in hand. At sunrise the next day, the Legion formed a line beneath the rising mist, the cracked amulet now resting flat against Lucius' chest, its fissure barely noticeable under his tunic. The march was paced by the rhythmic thump of drums, each beat reverberating through the soldiers' boots and the quiet riverbank. As they crossed the shallow ford, the water brushed coolly against their calves, and the amulet caught a fleeting glint, unnoticed but present. Discipline held firm, the troops moving as an organized tide. The earlier superstition folded into the background hum of marching feet. The battlefield ahead remained a blank slate, awaiting the inevitable clash. Yet the Legion pressed forward with a steadier, unhurried breath. When the dust settled after the day's skirmish, the survivors gathered near the camp's edge, their armor bearing dents and their faces marked by a tired calm. Lucius removed his cracked amulet, feeling its weight less as a portent and more as a reminder of survival. Its surface warmed by the lingering sun. He placed it gently into Gaia's hands, who polished it once more, the quiet motion a ritual of acceptance rather than fear. The legionaries exchanged soft nods, their conversation drifting to the simple pleasure of a shared meal, and the quiet night beyond the encampment walls. In the lingering amber light, the story of the cracked charm dissolved into the ordinary cadence of soldiers returning to routine. A subtle lesson that the smallest objects often bear the greatest quiet stories. The legions moved in steady columns through a valley shrouded in low mist, each man's boots muffled by the damp earth, and the faint scent of pine lingering in the air. Small iron amulets hung from the necks of the soldiers, their dull surfaces catching a weak glint whenever a stray sunbeam pierced the fog. The rhythm of the march was punctuated by the occasional clink of metal against leather, a quiet reminder of the superstitions that steadied weary hearts. At the front, the centurion's standard fluttered lazily, its red cloth absorbing the pale light as the men's breaths formed transient clouds. Even the distant hills seemed to watch the procession, their outlines softened by the vapor, while the road ahead remained a muted ribbon of uncertainty. The soldiers whispered to one another about the good luck promised by the charms, their voices low enough not to disturb the stillness surrounding them. Midway through the valley, A sudden crack split the sky as thick clouds gathered and unleashed a brief but fierce thunderstorm. Rain hammered the helmets, cold water seeping through the woolen tunics and making the leather straps of the amulets feel heavier in the damp air. A flash of lightning struck a nearby oak, splintering a piece of its bark that fell onto a soldier's talisman, cracking its surface and leaving a bright, jagged vein of ash across the metal. The storm's roar echoed off the stone walls, and the sudden glow of the fractured talisman drew the eyes of the legion like a silent alarm. Men paused, their faces slick with rain, and the sound of distant enemy drums became a muted thrum beneath the rain's patter. The abrupt omen whispered of danger, yet also of a strange, inadvertent protection forged in the storm's own fury. Around the faint fire the centurions gathered, their cloaks soaked, debating whether the fractured talisman signaled a need to retreat or a herald of forced courage. One officer, pointing to the cracked charm, argued that the lightning had already marked their path, and that pressing forward would honor the heavens' unsteady blessing. Another, more pragmatic, suggested that the storm's suddenness was a reminder of nature's caprice, urging caution until the clouds cleared. Their voices rose and fell in measured tones, each word landing softly on the wet ground, while the enemy, barely visible in the shadows beyond the ridge, seemed to listen without stirring. The irony of the moment lay in the fact that a piece of broken wood, now fused with iron, had become the centerpiece of strategic deliberation. As if a simple accident could outweigh the weight of disciplined training, the discussion stretched into the night, the rain tapering off, leaving a lingering scent of wet stone and iron. When the storm finally subsided, the legion chose to encamp beneath a natural alcove, the rocks offering shelter from the lingering chill. Soldiers arranged their shields in a loose circle, and the faint glow of the battered talisman was set beside a modest fire, its ember light casting soft shadows on the worn faces of the men. The night air carried the distant howl of wolves, yet the camp settled into a quiet rhythm of men mending leather straps, cleaning rust from amulets, and sharing measured laughter over stale rations. The centurions, still holding their debate, found a quiet compromise, allowing time for the clouds to disperse and for the men's nerves to settle. In the hush, the rain slicked ground emitted a faint, earthy smell, and the steady tick of a soldier's watch merged with the fire's crackle, creating a lullaby of patience. The enemy remained unseen, their silhouettes barely discernible against the dark hills, their presence a patient whisper rather than an immediate threat. With dawn breaking, the mist lifted like a thin veil, revealing the valley in soft gold tones that brushed the armor of the legionaries with gentle warmth. The amulets, now dry, rested against the chests of the men, their once cracked surface reflecting the new light, as if quietly affirming their endurance. The centurions, having rested their arguments, signaled the advance with a muted pull of the reins, and the soldiers rose in unison, the sound of leather creaking like a low sigh. As the column moved forward, the distant enemy shadows lingered at the edge of the horizon, their shapes indistinct, while the legion's steady steps resonated with a quiet confidence. The journey continued, each footfall a reminder that superstition and strategy coexist in the same breath, offering comfort without certainty. In the calm after the storm, the men carried forward not only their weapons, but also the subtle lesson that hope can be as fragile as a cracked talisman, yet still shine when the world steadies. At the edge of the river plain, the morning mist clung to the sand as the first Roman cohort assembled, each legionary adjusting the leather straps of his larica and checking the small bronze amulet that hung from his neck, a token of Bellona, whose face was forever hidden in shadow. The air smelled of damp earth and distant pine, and the low murmur of disciplined footsteps blended with the distant rustle of the tribal camp beyond the ridge. Soldiers exchanged brief nods, their gloved hands brushing the smooth surfaces of talismans that had been whispered to keep misfortune at bay. A thin, red hue began to bleed into the sky, unnoticed by most, while the legion's centurions whispered the old sayings about the tides of war turning when a charm fell. In that quiet preparation, the ritual of superstition felt as ordinary as the worn boots on their feet. As the eclipse deepened, a strange copper glow washed over the battlefield, turning the clouds into a thin veil that softened the harsh glare of the sun. And the distant warband emerged, drums beating a slow, resonant rhythm that trembled the dust. The legionaries tightened their grip on the iron gladius, feeling the cool metal against calloused palms, while the wind carried the scent of sweat and crushed herbs from the enemy fires. The clash began with a muted clang of shields, a sound that seemed to echo slower under the blood-red sky. Each contact a soft thud against the hardened earth. The heat of bodies and the occasional splash of spilled oil created a warm, humid curtain that wrapped the combatants like a sigh. Tension rose, yet the cadence of the fight remained measured, as if the world itself were watching with patient eyes. In the midst of a thrust, Marcus's bronze charm slipped from its cord, tumbling through the thickened air with a faint tinkling that seemed louder than the surrounding chaos, and landed squarely on the wooden shield of a tribal warrior. The impact was brief, but the sight of the gleaming talisman upon the enemy's armor sparked a hushed gasp among the legionaries, who interpreted the fall as a sign from the unseen face of Bellona, veiled by shadow. A momentary pause rippled through the ranks, the clatter of swords subsiding into a soft, collective breath held by men who trusted in omen more than in strategy. The tribal combatant, startled, twisted the shield and stumbled back, his own breath a sudden cloud in the cool night air. The irony of a small object deciding the course of battle, folded into the larger pattern of human belief, unnoticed by the indifferent stars above. With the charm now embedded in the enemy's defense, the legionary line surged forward in a controlled wave. The sound of marching feet turning into a steady drum that reverberated through the red-tinged dusk. The tribal formation cracked, their shields rattling like fragile jars, and the Romans advanced with measured steps, their helmets reflecting the dim light in muted bronze. The clash softened into a series of coordinated pushes, each movement deliberate, as the initial turmoil settled into a quiet rhythm of conquest. When the enemy line finally gave way, the soldiers stood briefly, their breathing steady, the air around them cool and heavy with the lingering scent of burnt pine. The battlefield, now quiet save for the distant crackle of fire, felt like a pause in an endless story, the fallen charm still glinting faintly in the dimness. Later, as the Legion camp settled into the soft glow of embers, the men gathered around simple wooden tables, sharing stale bread and lukewarm wine, while the bronze charm of Bellona rested on a wooden plank, its surface dull from the days where they spoke in low tones about the strange turn of events, noting how a tiny token could sway the tide of war, a reminder of their own frailty and the comfort they found in superstition. The conversation drifted to the quiet acceptance that fortunes rise and fall like the slow breathing of the earth, and that the unseen faces of the gods remained as unknowable as the night sky. A gentle chuckle rose when a younger legionary recounted how his brother had once lost a similar amulet to a pigeon, and the group smiled, recognizing the mundane absurdity woven through their histories. In the lingering hush, the legionaries rested, their thoughts settling like dust on the ancient stones, aware that the greatest battles were often fought within the softest corners of belief. The sun had slipped behind the low hills, leaving a thin veil of amber light over the broken field where the Legion had clashed. Dust settled like a thin blanket, and the clink of metal gave way to the soft sigh of wind through the grasses. Each soldier carried a small iron or bronze amulet, worn close to the breast, its surface etched with faded symbols that had been whispered about in the camp long before the first spear struck. Even as the thunder of battle faded, the quiet of the evening pressed against their helmets, inviting a slow, collective breath. In this muted moment, the men began to notice the weight of the charms they had pressed to their hearts, as if the metal itself had absorbed the heat of combat. The wounded lay on rough stone slabs, their breaths shallow, the scent of blood mixing with the earth's damp aroma. Medics moved with careful hands, bandaging torn flesh, while the distant groan of a broken spear echoed faintly across the plain. A low murmur rose among the legionaries, half concern, half relief, as they exchanged glances over the half-visible scars of their comrades. The metallic clatter of armor was now replaced by the rustle of sandaled feet, and the occasional creak of a stretched bowstring being set aside. Yet beneath the practical urgency, a nervous tremor lingered, as each man wondered whether the small charms had truly shielded them from the enemy's blade. In the soft glow of the evening, the legionaries began to speak of the amulets with a wry, almost sleepy humor, as if the charms were reluctant heroes of the day. One veteran lifted his talisman, a simple obsidian disc, and pretended to polish it, noting that its surface seemed smoother after the clash, as though it had been smoothed by the very blows that missed his chest. Their laughter was restrained, a quiet acknowledgement that superstition could be as sturdy as any shield, yet also as fragile as a sigh. The irony rested not in the belief itself, but in the gentle way the men let the ritual temper their fatigue, allowing a small, shared myth to ease the heaviness of the night. Their voices blended with the rustling reeds, turning the battlefield into a quiet theater of human absurdity, softened by habit. When the last wound was tended, and the firelight dimmed to a steady ember, the soldiers gathered around a flat stone altar that had been cleared of debris. One by one, they placed their amulets upon the cold surface, arranging them like a modest offering of metal and hope. The act was deliberate, yet unhurried, each fingers brushing the worn edges before laying the charm down, feeling the subtle temperature of stone against metal. A soft wind brushed the altar, causing a faint echo that seemed to acknowledge the quiet ceremony without fanfare. In this calm pause, the legionaries sensed a collective gratitude, not only for survival, but for the simple ritual that had stitched their scattered thoughts together. As the night deepened, Marcus, the unit's scribe, took a blank wooden tablet and recorded the day's events in careful, measured strokes, noting the placement of each charm and the names of those who had tended the wounded. He traced the outlines of the amulets on the tablet's edge, preserving not just the battle's outcome, but the subtle belief that had steadied the men. The tablet would be stored in the Legion's archive, a quiet testament that future soldiers might read about both steel and superstition entwined. The act of writing felt like a gentle seal, a final brush of ink against wood that echoed the earlier touch of metal on stone. In that lingering hush, the legionaries rested, their breaths sinking with the night's slow rhythm, while the recorded words waited patiently for the next sunrise. As the sun slipped behind the hills of Campania, the air grew cool, and the camp settled into a low murmur of tired soldiers. Marcus, a new recruit with mud still clinging to his sandals, was polishing his gladius when his blade struck something hard beneath the shallow furrows of the training ground. He brushed away the earth to reveal a polished femur charm, its surface warm from the day's heat and oddly smooth to the touch. The relic, said in whispered tales to belong to the blurred founder whose face was never seen, sparked a quiet curiosity in his chest. He slipped it into his leather belt, feeling the faint weight as if a small promise were now tied to his own skin. Word of the charm traveled faster than the evening breeze, fluttering from tent to tent as men gathered around the flickering firelight. The centurion's voice, low and measured, asked whether the bone could truly carry the spirit of the unseen founder, and a rustle of uneasy anticipation rose from the ranks. Some legionaries brushed the charm with their fingers, feeling its coolness against the heat of their own palms, while others kept a cautious distance, fearing that hope might be as fragile as the polished surface. The camp's usual rhythm, boots on packed earth, distant clang of armor, was punctuated by a low hum of speculation, each heartbeat echoing a faint, unspoken tension. Yet the night remained steady, the stars indifferent, as the soldiers waited to see whether superstition could translate into steel. When the first dawn found the legion preparing for the march, the charm sat modestly on Marcus's chest, unnoticed by most, and yet oddly central to his thoughts. Ironically, the men who had spoken of heroic vigor now found themselves sharing simple meals, passing the bone back and forth as a trinket rather than a talisman of invincibility. A veteran, his beard dusted with ash, chuckled softly, noting that the charm's only power seemed to be its ability to bring a brief pause to the endless grind of drills. The sound of his laughter, low and a little weary, cut through the tension like a gentle blade, reminding everyone that the weight of legend often rested more on imagination than on any physical object. In that moment, the legion's morale settled into a quiet rhythm, the charm serving more as a shared story than a mystical weapon. Days turned into weeks, and the legion moved across the rolling countryside, the charm now a silent companion to Marcus as he tightened his cuirass and adjusted his sandals. The routine of marching, the rustle of the leather straps, the occasional splash of river water against tired boots created a steady backdrop against which the bone lay unnoticed yet present. At night, when the camp settled into soft sighs and the distant howl of wolves, The men would sit on the fire's edge, the glow painting their faces in amber, and speak of the charm in hushed tones, more for comfort than for belief. The temperature of the night air, cool and steady, seemed to mirror the calm that had settled over the cohort. A collective acceptance that small objects could anchor their humanity amidst the endless demands of war. In this unhurried cadence, the Legion found a modest solidarity, bound not by grand destiny, but by the quiet companionship of ordinary moments. Years later, after the campaign had faded into the annals of memory, and the bones of countless soldiers lay scattered across the earth, Marcus returned to the same patch of ground, now overgrown with wild thyme. He knelt, fingers brushing the soil, feeling the absence of the charm that had once rested against his chest, its loss as gentle as a whispered goodbye. The realization settled like a soft dusk. The true strength of the relic had never lain in any magical assurance, but in the subtle way it had drawn men together, reminding them of shared fragility. In the quiet of the evening, the faint scent of rosemary drifted, and the distant crackle of a campfire flickered in his mind, a reminder that morale is often forged in the smallest of gestures. With a slow, contented breath, Marcus stood, carrying forward the quiet lesson that even a polished femur, unseen and unassuming, can linger in the heart of a legion long after its surface has faded. At the edge of the marching camp, a weathered femur, polished by the sun and the hands of a forgotten soldier, lay on a wooden crate, its surface still warm from the day's heat. The new recruits, still raw to the cadence of the Legion, gathered around it, the faint clink of metal armor punctuating their whispered curiosity. A veteran centurion, his bronze breastplate reflecting a muted orange sky, observed from a distance, his eyes tracing the delicate patterns of dust that settled upon the bone. The air carried the scent of boiled lentils and the distant murmur of a river, grounding the strange curiosity in everyday life. In that quiet moment, the charm seemed less a relic and more a silent promise of protection, awaiting the camp's slow acceptance. Soon, the quiet turned into a murmuring current as rumors slipped through the ranks like wind through the tent flaps. Some veterans scoffed, their voices low but firm, comparing the bone to the solid clang of a gladius, while the younger men clutched at the idea of a hidden safeguard against unseen wounds. The camp's routine sharpening swords, mending sandals, sharing stale bread, was now threaded with speculation, each clatter of a shield echoing a question. A centurion's bark, sharp as a whip, warned against superstition. Yet the recruits whispered back with a reverence that felt almost reverent. The tension settled like a thin layer of fog, visible in the narrowed eyes, and the hesitant steps of those who sensed an invisible line drawn between belief and steel. Irony settled in the space between the crackling fire and the cool night air, where the very same bone that sparked anxiety also sparked camaraderie among the newest soldiers. They exchanged jokes about the charm's power, pretending to shield themselves with it while simultaneously polishing their helmets, as if the hum of steel could drown out the mystic whisper of marrow. The seasoned centurions watched the scene with a half smile, their weathered faces half hidden by the glow of the fire, noting how the simple object turned the camp into a stage of quiet theater. The rivalry, bone versus blade, was less a clash of weapons than a gentle contest of stories, each side offering a shrug or a chuckle rather than a sharp rebuke. The evening settled into a rhythm of soft laughter, the subtle absurdity of belief mingling with the practical cadence of marching drills. As the night deepened, the camp fell into a hushed routine. The clang of armor softened, the smell of cooling stew lingered, and the bone rested untouched on the crate, its surface now slick with a thin sheen of dew. Soldiers shifted in their bivouacs, the rustle of blankets and the occasional sigh creating a backdrop of calm that muffled earlier disputes. The centurions, now seated on the perimeter, watched the recruits settle, their eyes reflecting the dim ember light, a silent acknowledgement of the shared humanity beneath the armor. Even the wind seemed to pause, brushing the canvas roofs with a gentle sigh, as if granting the camp a brief respite from its own restless heartbeat. In this stillness, the charm became part of the landscape, a muted part of the camp's ordinary texture rather than a focal point of contention. When dawn brushed the tents with a pale amber hue, the bone remained where it had been, unnoticed by most, yet subtly woven into the memory of the legion. The soldiers rose, their feet stirring cool sand, the scent of fresh wheat mingling with the lingering hint of smoke, each carrying a small, perhaps unspoken, conviction that something beyond steel steadied their stride. The centurions, their gauntlets now dusted with sunrise, reflected on the quiet lesson that belief, however humble, can knit together a line of men marching under a common banner. The day's march resumed with the same steady drum of hooves and the soft rustle of shields, the charm no longer a subject of gossip, but a quiet testament to human tendency to seek comfort in relics. In the end, the camp moved forward, bearing both the weight of iron and the faint, enduring echo of a bone that once whispered of bravery. The stone road to Alba stretched thin under the weight of the marching legion, dust rising in a slow plume that caught the late afternoon sun. Soldiers in faded larica hung their helmets against the wind, their boots rhythmically striking the packed earth. Among them, Marcus, a veteran centurion, kept a small bronze charm tucked in the worn leather of his belt, its surface dulled by years of handling. He would press it to his palm before each step, feeling the cool weight as a quiet reminder of past victories. The camp settled beside a modest hillside, the faint scent of herbs mixing with the metallic tang of iron. Soon the supplies dwindled to a ragged collection of cracked wheat jars and a leaking barrel of watered wine. The ration clerk's sigh audible across the encampment. Nightly, the enemy from the town of Alba sent swift sorties, their torches flickering like restless fireflies against the dark sky, the clatter of spears being readied blended with the muted thumps of marching feet, each echo a reminder of the thin line between endurance and surrender. Marcus tightened his grip on the charm, its surface now catching a stray ember's glow, the cold stone of the siege ramp pressed against his back, sending a shiver that seemed to come from the earth itself. Yet the men continued to dig, their breath forming thin clouds in the crisp air. Rumors spread through the ranks that the charm had once been saved from a fallen hero's tomb. Its origin whispered in the same hushed tones used for the unseen faces of distant augurs. Soldiers chuckled lightly, swapping the story for a tired smile as they passed the wooden watchtower. The irony of a tiny trinket bolstering spirits in a war of stone, the charm's faint patina, barely visible under the dim lantern light, seemed to mock the grand expectations of triumph. Yet each time the enemy's arrows clattered against the barricade, a quiet murmur rose. As long as the charm stays close, a mantra as lukewarm as the broth they ate. The irony lay in how such a modest object could stead a line that had begun to fray. Morning broke with a soft amber wash that settled over the camp, the heat easing the chill that had settled in the night's last watch. Men gathered around a simple wooden table, sharing stale cheese and thin slices of dried figs, the quiet rustle of wrappers accompanying their low conversation. Marcus placed the charm on the central slab, its edge catching the light, and the legionaries nodded, their eyes half closed, the tension easing like a drawn bow released. The sound of distant hammers striking the ramping earth merged with the occasional cough of a tired soldier, a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. In that steady hum, the line held, each footfall measured, each shield positioned with a deliberate slowness that suggested acceptance rather than resistance. The siege, though still unfinished, had become a series of small, repeatable motions that the men could predict and thus endure. When at last the gates of Alba lowered, the town's stone walls revealed a muted twilight that seemed to exhale with the legion's sigh. The charm, now dulled further by dust and sweat, rested silently in Marcus's hand, its story having blended into the collective memory of the weary soldiers. They moved through the quiet streets, the clink of sandals on cobbles a soft punctuation to the dim glow of oil lamps. In the camp later, the fire crackled low, casting gentle shadows that made the faces of the men appear both familiar and slightly blurred, as if the night itself wished to keep their fatigue unobserved. The siege was recorded not as a blaze of glory, but as a gentle reminder that endurance often lives in the small, unattended moments between conflict and peace. In the early morning mist, the Roman legion bivouacked against the stone walls of the besieged town, the tents smelling of damp canvas and ash. Marcus, a veteran centurion, slipped a polished bone charm into his leather grip, the smooth surface cold against his palm. Around him, the clink of metal armor and the soft tread of boots created a rhythm as steady as the distant river. The campfire cracked, sending brief sparks into the chill air, while the soldiers exchanged quiet jokes about the day's work. Yet beneath the routine, a shared feeling of cautious hope lingered, as each man kept his gaze fixed on the distant ramparts. When the first shout rose from the enemy's breach, the sound cut through the calm like a sudden gust, stirring dust and panic in equal measure. The stone gate groaned, and a plume of smoke curled upward, tinged with the metallic scent of blood that had already been spilled. Soldiers tightened straps, their shields scraping against the hard ground, while the wind carried the echo of marching feet from beyond the walls. Marcus felt the bone charm press harder against his chest, its weight suddenly more pronounced against the thudding of his own heart. The tension folded into the air, making every breath feel heavier, as the legion braced for the imminent clash. In the midst of that pressure, Marcus lifted his hand, flashing the bone charm toward the front rank, its pale surface catching the wan light. A hesitant murmur rose among the troops, then swelled into a low, unified roar that seemed to shake the very stone beneath their feet. The irony was palpable. A simple token of ancestry, shaped from the marrow of forgotten beasts, now became a beacon of collective bravery. The sound of shields slamming together resonated like a drumbeat, and the clatter of swords was suddenly organized, each strike echoing the rhythm of the chant. The enemy, caught off guard by the sudden surge of morale, faltered as the legion surged forward in a coordinated tide. When the final clang of steel faded, a gentle hush settled over the courtyard, broken only by the soft rustle of discarded banners and the distant call of a night bird. The ground, still warm from recent combat, smelled faintly of sweat and earth, a reminder of the effort required to secure the breach. Soldiers lowered their weapons, the metal cooling against their forearms, and some rested a weary hand on the bone charm, feeling its smoothness under a quiet fingertip. Small fires were relit, casting amber glows that painted faces with expressions of quiet satisfaction and mild fatigue. In that calm, the Legion gathered around a communal bowl, sharing stale bread and water, their conversation as unhurried as the flickering flames. Later, as the stars emerged behind a thin veil of cloud, Marcus cradled the bone charm in his palm, the darkness inside it reflecting the soft light of the camp. He thought of the countless hands that had once held similar pieces, each bearing the ordinary weight of survival and the fleeting spark of hope. The victory felt less like a grand triumph and more like the steady persistence of ordinary men willing to follow a modest symbol. A soft sigh escaped his lips, blending with the night breeze that brushed the tents, reminding him that glory often hides in quiet gestures. The Legion, now settled, rested beneath the ancient walls, their dreams mingling with the faint echo of distant drums, a reminder that even in triumph, humanity remains gently imperfect. The dust-laden road out of Alba stretched beneath the setting sun as the 12th Legion slipped back toward Rome. A wooden box, cradling a single bone charm, clutched in Marcus' gloved hand. The charm had been carved from the femur of a fallen enemy, its surface smoothed by the heat of the campfire, and the steady polishing of a night shift smith. Soldiers whispered its name as they passed the wooden arches of the city gates, their sandals stirring the cool stone dust. The eagle's standard fluttered above them, its shadow falling over the crowd like a quiet promise of stability. In the waning light, Marcus felt the weight of the relic as much as the weight of his own breath, a reminder that bravery could be held in something as modest as bone. The march had been punctuated by the distant clatter of distant skirmishes, the thin echo of war drums that never quite faded from the hills beyond the Via Flaminia. Each night the Legion camped on hard ground, the air growing chillier, and the soldiers' hands clenched around the leather straps of their shields, as if trying to seize certainty. Rumors of a lingering enemy raid slipped through the ranks, stirring a low murmur that brushed against the rhythm of marching steps. Marcus could feel the subtle tremor in his own pulse when the bone charm brushed against his chest, a small, cold reminder that the battle had not entirely ended. The tension settled like a thin fog, waiting for a word or a wind to disperse it. It was oddly amusing how the smallest token, a carved fragment of bone, captured more attention than the gleaming bronze helmets polished each morning. Young legionaries, eyes half closed from the long road, would jest about the ghost of a cow's thigh that now hung from a leather thong. Yet They unconsciously adjusted their posture when the charm caught the dying light. The irony lay in the contrast. A relic born of death used to soothe the living, a silent talisman offering comfort, while the empire's grand triumphs marched on in marble. Even the centurions, whose voices usually boomed over the clatter of marching boots, lowered their tone to speak of the charm's origin, as if sharing a private joke. In that quiet humor, the bone became a bridge between fear and confidence, a paradox that steadied the line without any fanfare. When the legion finally entered the low arched hallway of the barracks, the evening lamp oil cast a mellow amber glow over the benches and the worn wooden tables. Soldiers settled with cracked loaves of barley bread, the scent of warm porridge drifting through the room as they passed the charm from one palm to another, its smooth surface cool against calloused fingers. Marcus sat beside a veteran who traced the bone's grain with a thumb, their conversation slipping into the easy cadence of shared stories about distant hills and forgotten villages. The eagle standard stood at the rear, its feathers rustling softly in the night breeze that slipped through open shutters, reminding everyone of the larger purpose without demanding attention. In the gentle hush, the relic rested on a simple cloth. Its presence felt more in the quiet steadiness of breathing than in any shouted proclamation. Months later, messengers carried the tale of the bone charm to far-flung forts, where new recruits pressed it into the wood of their personal amulets, believing the same quiet strength could travel with them. The tradition, once an impromptu gesture, settled into the legion's ritual. Every winter, a small piece of bone was placed beside the eagle's shadow during the ceremonial oath, a subtle nod to the humbler origins of collective bravery. Historians would later note how this modest token softened the rigid edges of discipline, allowing the soldiers to envision themselves not merely as instruments of empire, but as individuals linked by a shared, tactile memory. The story lingered in the annals like a soft echo, reminding future generations that morale could be nurtured by the simple act of holding something real and warm in one's palm. Under the slow turn of the stars, the legion's shadow stretched long. Yet it was the quiet pulse of a bone that whispered, without haste, that courage endures in the smallest of things. At the pale edge of the Danube, the winter camp of Legio XXII settled into a hushed rhythm, the wooden palisade casting long shadows in the low light. The chilled air carried the scent of pine smoke, rising from the communal hearth that Marcus Valerius, the camp's augur, tended with deliberate calm. New recruits gathered around the fire, their boots rattling softly against the packed earth as they listened to his low voice describing the ancient habit of whispering to Fortuna. Hands raw from the cold, reached for the smooth stones used to draw lots, each stone a mute promise of duty. In the dim glow, the faces of the augur remained a blur, hidden by the flickering blaze, as if the very light protected his inner thoughts from scrutiny. The wind grew sharper, stirring the river's surface into a thin, silver foam that seemed to echo the soldiers' unease. As each recruit drew a lot, a subtle tension rippled through the circle. The crack of wood underfoot punctuated the silence like a hesitant heartbeat. The stones clattered against the stone slab, and the names inscribed on them, Signifer, Tyarns, Vexillarius, felt heavier than the winter air. Marcus' voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of expectation, reminding the men that luck, though invisible, guided every sword stroke. A thin veil of smoke curled around the hearth, muffling the distant clang of armor, and amplifying the moment's fragile anticipation. When the lots fell, a quiet irony settled over the camp. The most eager recruit found himself assigned to the quiet watch of the gates, while a seasoned veteran was given the humble task of grinding grain. The soldiers exchanged glances, the humor of fate lingering like a half-smile in their eyes. Yet no one spoke aloud, respecting the unseen presence of the augur's blurred visage. The fire's orange tongues licked the night, casting fleeting light on the worn leather of their shields, reminding them that circumstance could turn as swiftly as the wind. Even the distant howl of a lone wolf seemed to mock the notion of control, as if nature herself were drawing lots beside them. In that shared, unspoken laugh, the camp sensed the delicate balance between order and the caprice of chance. Soon the fire settled into a steady, comforting glow, and the recruits returned to their bunks, the night's tension melting into the soft rustle of wool blankets. The cadence of a distant drumbeat marked the passing of the hours, mingling with the gentle creak of wooden walls as they expanded in the cold. Marcus stood a moment longer by the hearth, his silhouette barely discernible against the ember light, his hands resting on the stone altar as if feeling the pulse of unseen luck. Around him, soldiers whispered low prayers to Fortuna, their voices a muted river flowing into the night, each word a small offering of trust. The camp breathed as one organism, its rhythm slow and deliberate. The day's uncertainties folded into the quiet continuity of routine. When dawn finally brushed the Danube with a pale pink hue, the soldiers rose with a measured grace, the memory of the night's lot still lingering like the faint scent of smoke. Marcus watched them from the periphery, his face still veiled by shadow, as they tightened straps and shouldered spears, each movement a testament to the fragile partnership between skill and chance. The river below sang a low, steady murmur, reminding them that the world turned regardless of human designs. In the soft light, the camp seemed both ordinary and profound, a place where everyday actions carried the weight of ancient belief, yet remained grounded in simple human effort. As the day stretched forward, the men carried their assignments with quiet acceptance, aware that luck was less a deity than a quiet companion walking beside them. The winter camp rested beneath a thin veil of pale sky, its timber walls exhaling the scent of damp earth and pine. At its heart, a low fire crackled, sending thin ribbons of smoke to drift over the rows of legionary tents. Alia, the camp's appointed mystic, moved among the embers with a smooth wooden spoon, stirring ash, while her face remained a shadow behind the flickering light. The soldiers, weary from marching, paused their chores to watch the gentle rise of the flames, the quiet punctuated only by the soft clink of metal armor being repaired. In this stillness, the night seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something unnamed to emerge from the smoke. When the wind shifted, the smoke swirled strangely, forming fleeting silhouettes that suggested a wolf's snout and the jagged edge of a broken shield. A murmur spread through the ranks, the rustle of leather, and the occasional sigh of a tired soldier. Alia lifted her hands, her fingertips brushing the warm coals, and the augurs gathered, their eyes narrowed toward the darkened shapes. Their whispers carried the weight of old superstitions, noting that wolves meant hunger, while shattered armor foretold loss. The camp's rhythm faltered. The crack of a distant spear being sharpened sounded louder than usual, and a cold draft slipped through the canvas, brushing the backs of the men. Yet the fire continued to hiss, indifferent to the rising unease. The augurs, their faces obscured by the glow, offered a paradoxical reading. The wolf could also symbolize vigilant guardians, and a broken shield might warn of a needed renewal rather than defeat. Alia smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth barely visible beneath the hood that hid her visage, and began a quiet chant that rose like steam from the fire. The irony lay in the fact that the same smoke that warned of danger now served as a canvas for hopeful reinterpretation. The legionaries exchanged glances, some tightening the straps of their sandals, others loosening the grip on their spears, as the ritual unfolded without fanfare. A faint chuckle escaped a tired centurion, noting that perhaps the gods appreciated a well-timed joke. The tension dissolved into a gentle rhythm, the night absorbing the ceremony like a patient listener. As the chant waned, the fire settled into a steady glow, its heat warming the rough stone of the hearth. Alia extinguished the coals with a damp cloth, the sizzle mingling with the soft murmurs of the augurs packing their tablets. soldiers returned to mundane tasks. A cook ladled stew into iron bowls. A blacksmith pounded quietly on a glowing blade. And a messenger traced a route on sand with a simple stick. The night air, cool and dry, brushed against their sleeves, reminding them of the coming march without imposing urgency. Even the distant howl of a stray wolf seemed less an omen and more a background hum, unnoticed by those focused on the simple act of feeding themselves. In that ordinary cadence, the camp found a steady heartbeat once more. When dawn painted the horizon with a wash of soft amber, the Legion rose with measured steps, the memory of the night's fire lingering like a faint aftertaste. Aelia slipped away before the first column formed, her cloak blending with the pale mist, her hidden face never revealed to those she had guided. The soldiers carried their shields, now polished and whole, and their spears, feeling the strange comfort of an omen that had turned into a quiet reassurance. The march toward the Marcomanni frontier began under a sky that seemed indifferent, yet somehow more generous. In the end, the luck of the flames rested not in prophecy, but in the steady hands of men who learned to read the ordinary as something worth noting. The camp, left behind, settled back into its slow rhythm, as if the fire had simply been another night's breath. At the first light of camp, the legionnaires formed a rough circle around a low wooden table, the air scented with the faint iron of morning and the smoke of a smoldering hearth. Aelia, the camp's priestess, lifted a handful of bronze dice, their surfaces warm from the fire, and whispered a blessing that softened into a sigh, her face veiled by the shadow of her hood. Each soldier reached for a die, feeling the cool weight glide between fingers, and rolled it onto the sand, listening to the muted clatter as numbers scattered like tiny, indifferent stars. The numeral that rose determined the small talisman each man would craft: a copper knot, a leather strap, a folded leaf stitched into the leather of his shield. In the quiet exchange, the act of chance settled like a gentle mist over the men, marking the start of the day's uneasy preparation. Soon the murmurs grew louder as centurions stepped forward, their sandals thudding on the packed earth, eyes scanning the rows of dice-scarred faces. The commanders, accustomed to marching by supply lines and strategy, frowned at the ritual, their voices low but firm, arguing that steel and formation mattered more than charms forged from superstition. A handful of soldiers, clutching their newly made talismans, muttered that they would not step beyond the ramparts without the luck they felt in their hands. The weight of the bronze, a quiet anchor against uncertainty. Others, arms crossed over armor, scoffed, their laughter sharp as a blade. Yet their eyes flicked repeatedly toward the small objects glinting in the dim light. The tension hung in the air like the heat rising from the campfire, a thin line between disciplined order and the soft pull of belief. By midday, the sun had softened, casting a honeyed glow over the camp, and the dice lay scattered, their faces half covered by dust, as if the ground itself was reluctant to reveal their secrets. Some veterans, who had never before bowed to any omen, found themselves polishing the copper knots with a slow, almost reverent motion. The scratch of metal against leather echoing a subdued chuckle among the ranks. Ironically, those who had ridiculed the practice now lingered near the table, their curiosity masked by a nonchalant shrug, watching the glow of melted wax sealing each charm. The sound of distant marching boots blended with the occasional clink of dice being set aside, creating a rhythm that felt both ordinary and oddly ceremonious. In that subtle dance of irony, the camp settled into a shared, unspoken acknowledgement that belief and doubt could coexist like two soldiers sharing a common watchtower. As the shadows lengthened, the camp settled into a gentle hush. The fire crackled softly, sending occasional sparks into the cool evening air. Soldiers rested on wooden benches, the talismans tucked into the folds of their tunics, their fingers tracing the faint embossing of the bronze, feeling the temperature ebbing from warm to night cool. The clang of a distant bucket fell into a rhythm with the soft rustle of linen, and even the most skeptical centurions allowed a moment of stillness, their helmets resting beside them, the metal dimly reflecting the amber light. Alia, still a silhouette behind the veil of her cloak, moved among the men, handing out small pouches of dried herbs, her presence more a whisper than a command. The camp, once stirred by friction, now breathed as one, the dice and their charms becoming quiet companions rather than sources of division. When dawn rose again, the legion prepared to move. The clatter of armor and the muted thud of sandals merging with the soft rustle of the talismans being secured once more. Though the battlefield awaited, the memory of the bronze dice lingered like a low hum, reminding each soldier that chance and preparation share a common pulse. The commanders, having observed the steady resolve of their men, allowed a brief nod to the ritual, recognizing that the comfort found in the small charms could steady a hand as surely as any drill. Even as the troops marched forward, the camp's quiet lessons stayed behind, folded into the leather of shields and the empty space where dice had once rested. In the slow march of years, the story of those blessed dice would be told in low tones around fires, a modest testament to humanity's gentle struggle between certainty and the quiet hope that slips through the cracks of armor. The legion's camp stretched across the amber plain, rows of tents rustling in a light wind that carried the scent of damp earth. At the far edge, an augur with a face hidden in shadow traced the horizon, his hands moving over a faded tablet. Nearby, a small wooden box held talismans that had been chosen by the toss of dice the previous night, each piece glinting faintly against the dust-streaked floor. Soldiers polished their cuirasses, while the camp cook stirred a pot of thin broth, the gentle clatter blending with the distant murmur of a river. The atmosphere settled into a routine calm, as if the day itself were merely another page in a ledger of marches. As the sun slipped behind a wandering cloud, an unexpected darkness began to swallow the sky, turning the midday into a cool twilight. A collective gasp rose from the ranks. The clank of metal momentarily hushed, and the cold air brushed against the exposed backs of the legionaries. The blurred silhouette of the augur raised his hands, his voice barely audible over the sudden hush, murmuring that Fortuna had drawn her veil across the battlefield. In the gloom, the dice-chosen talismans emitted a faint amber pulse, their light flickering like distant fireflies among the soldiers' helmets. Across the field, the enemy formations emerged as silhouettes, their shields catching the stray glow, and the legion's standard fluttered uncertainly in the still wind. The augur's pronouncement lingered, yet none could tell whether the veil was omen or merely shade, and the soldiers found themselves looking to the small charms for guidance. A centurion reached for his talisman, a tiny bronze amulet shaped like a laurel, and felt its cool metal against his palm, a silent promise that seemed both absurd and reassuring. When the first clash rang out, some men whose charms glowed brighter than others surged forward and broke the enemy's line, while adjacent cohorts stumbled and fell, their own talismans dimly alight. The irony lay in the randomness of fortune. The same dice that had chosen the charms now seemed to shuffle destiny itself, granting victory in one corner and loss in another. Amid the din, Marcus, a veteran with a weathered face, clutched a chipped stone inscribed with a single word, Lux, and steadied his breath, trusting the luck of his charm above any strategic plan. When the sun finally resurfaced, the battlefield lay strewn with broken spears, dust settling like softened ash on the grass. The clamor faded into a low murmur of groans, and the rustle of wounded men being tended to by medics, whose hands moved methodically over bandages. Marcus, his stone talisman now dull, stood beside a fallen foe, the quiet of the clearing allowing him a brief pause to wipe the sweat from his brow. The augur, still concealed in shadow, lowered his staff and watched the camp fire rekindle, its orange glow reaching out to warm the chilled stones. In the stillness, the legionaries gathered around the campfire, sharing stale bread and the soft clink of metal cups, the day's chaos dissolving into the slow rhythm of breath and ember. As night deepened, a gentle coolness settled over the encampment, and the soldiers' conversations turned to the mundane stories of homes left behind and the taste of olives at dusk. The lingering memory of the eclipse remained, not as a divine warning, but as a reminder of how easily human hope clings to a small, flickering token in the dark. History, observing from its wearied perch, notes the quiet irony that the legion survived not solely because of strategy, but because the men allowed a modest charm to shape their courage. In the soft glow of the fire, Marcus placed his stone back into the wooden box, its surface now warm from his palm, an unspoken acknowledgement of luck's fleeting hold. The camp settled into a rhythm of sleep, the distant rustle of the river echoing the steady pulse of time, and the story of the veiled sun rested, another measured breath in the long ledger of human endeavor. At the edge of the mist-draped hillside, the Roman camp settled like a row of folded blankets, its wooden palisades casting long shadows in the amber light. The scent of damp earth mingled with the faint odor of leather sandals, while a handful of mystics gathered near the fire, their faces hidden in the flickering glow. They whispered of Fortuna, tracing invisible patterns in the ash, and the clink of bronze armor nearby reminded the men of the day ahead. A messenger arrived, his sandals scuffing the packed dirt, bearing a simple wooden token that some swore was a lucky charm. The air held a quiet anticipation, as if the stones themselves waited to hear whether chance would favor steel. When the horn sounded, the camp awoke with a rush of cold wind that brushed the backs of soldiers, and the distant rumble of drums rose like a slow tide. Steel met shield in a chorus of metallic clangs, while the mystics watched from the periphery, their eyes veiled by the smoke of burning torches. A sudden gust lifted a stray feather onto a spearman's helm, and he paused, half smiling at the odd coincidence, before thrusting forward. The battle unfolded under a sky that shifted from iron gray to the soft pink of dawn, each moment punctuated by the creak of wooden shields and the muted thud of boots in mud. Amid the chaos, a stray coin slipped from a centurion's belt, glinting on the ground before being kicked away. A fleeting reminder of luck's unnoticed presence. Victory arrived with a measured clatter of swords laid down, yet the triumph felt oddly balanced on a thin thread of chance. The mystics stepped forward, their silhouettes blurred by the lingering smoke, and offered a quiet chant that seemed to thank an unseen hand. A weary legionary found his helmet tilted by a gust, revealing an insignia that matched the token the mystics had cherished, an ironical echo of the earlier feather. The camp's fire crackled, sending warm curls of smoke that curled around the stone walls, as if the night itself were sighing in relief. Though the Romans celebrated with modest feasts, the lingering taste of ash on their tongues reminded them that strategy alone had not secured the day. As night settled, the camp settled into a gentle rhythm. Water buckets clinked, blankets were folded, and the mystics passed a bowl of warm pottage among the soldiers, their hands steady and calm. The temperature dropped, and a thin frost brushed the tents, prompting a few men to adjust their cloaks, feeling the night's breath on their skin. In the low lantern light, a new creed was inscribed on a wooden tablet, its words speaking of skill, honed by practice and luck, honored as a silent partner. The tablet rested near the fire, its surface warm from the embers, and the camp's silence was punctuated only by the occasional sigh of a tired horse. The balance between discipline and destiny seemed to settle like dust on the stone floor, quiet and unassuming. When the sunrise painted the horizon with a muted orange, the mystics recorded the day's omens in a leather-bound chronicle, their pens moving softly over the parchment. Their faces remained masked by the soft morning light, allowing only the texture of their hands and the rustle of pages to convey reverence. The legionaries, now weary but upright, listened as the chronicler spoke of Fortuna's subtle nudges alongside the soldiers' deliberate tactics. The camp continued its routine, sharpening swords, mending tents, sharing a final bowl of broth, each motion a reminder that history is a series of quiet breaths between clashing waves. In that lingering quiet, the Romans carried forward a renewed faith, not in grand prophecy, but in the humble partnership of skill and the ever-present whisper of luck. The marble columns of the Forum of Augustus glowed softly as the late afternoon sun filtered through the high arches, casting a warm amber on the polished stones. Lucius, his cuirass still faintly humming from the day's heat, stood beside Ariston, whose bronze shield reflected a muted glare. Nepheret leaned against a limestone bench, the sand from his sandaled feet slipping gently onto his tunic, while Li Wei adjusted his bamboo crossbow with practiced ease. Scholars with scrolls of papyrus and silk gathered around a low wooden table, their ink pens scratching quietly on the parchment. The air carried the distant murmur of market stalls and the occasional clink of a distant legionary's armor, framing the delegation's quiet arrival. It was a moment that felt both ordinary and marked, as if history itself paused to listen to the soft rustle of curiosity. When the first scholar asked about the amulets each soldier carried, a subtle tension rose like the first note of a reed flute before a chorus. Lucius produced a small lead figurine of a wolf, its eyes dulled by centuries, and placed it on the table with a careful hand that trembled ever so faintly. Ariston revealed a carved olive leaf, its green pigment faded to a pale hue, whispering of harvest festivals and protective prayers. Neferet presented a scarab beetle encased in glass, its surface warm from the sun, while Li Wei offered a jade pendant etched with a dragon motif, its edges smooth from generations of polishing. The scholars leaned in, the parchment rustling louder, as if the tiny objects might speak louder than words. A slight hush settled, broken only by the occasional footstep of a passing courier delivering fresh bread. The conversation turned to the irony that such tiny charms, pressed against steel and sweat, were taken as seriously as the swords they accompanied. Lucius chuckled softly, noting that the wolf had once saved a legion from a sudden storm. Yet the legion had also stumbled in the very same rain. Ariston mused that the olive leaf was meant for peace, yet it rested in the grip of a man who had just returned from a fierce hoplite charge. Neferet smiled at the scarab, recalling a story of a pharaoh's victory that ended in a quiet burial, while Li Wei observed that the jade dragon was often polished by soldiers who had lost more than they won. Their laughter was gentle, a sound like distant water lapping against stone, underscoring how belief and routine wove together in the fabric of war. The scholars recorded these nuances with careful strokes, their quills sighing as they captured the subtle humor of human hope. As the sun lowered, the forum's shadows stretched, and the clamor of the city softened into a low, rhythmic hum. The delegation lingered, sipping thin wine from chipped cups, feeling the cool ceramic against their fingertips. Light filtered through the arches, painting the marble with bands of amber, and deepening the quiet that settled over the group. The scholars folded their scrolls, the rustle of parchment now a comforting backdrop to the distant chirp of cicadas. Each soldier stared at his talisman, the surfaces catching the dim light, their thoughts drifting like the gentle breeze that brushed past the column capitals. The moment stretched, unhurried, as if time itself were content to observe rather than intervene. When the delegation finally rose to depart, the forum seemed to exhale, the marble walls retaining a faint warmth from their presence. Lucius, Ariston, Neferet, and Li Wei walked away slowly, the soles of their sandals whispering against the stone, each bearing a small token of belief that felt both fragile and steadfast. The scholars watched them fade into the gathering dusk, their notes now inked with a quiet acknowledgement of humanity's enduring need for reassurance. In the lingering silence, the marble arches held the echo of a subtle lesson that every culture, regardless of empire, clings to modest symbols to navigate uncertainty. The night settled, wrapping the forum in a soft blanket of stillness, as if the ancient world were tucking itself into sleep, dreaming of the next quiet conversation. In the soft glow of the encampment fire, 4 warriors gathered around a low wooden table, each cradling a token that had traveled through generations. Lucius, his hands calloused from the grip of a gladius, lifted a bronze phallus etched with the sigil of Mars, its metal warm against his palm. Beside him, Ariston traced the edge of an olive leaf amulet to Athena, the green patina catching the flicker of flame as his fingers brushed it gently. Neferet's scarab, scarred with the eye of Ra, rested cool on a linen cloth, its carved wings humming a faint, imagined desert wind. Li Wei, eyes half closed, offered a jade rabbit, its smooth surface cool as river stone, said to summon good winds for the fleet beyond the horizon. A quiet contest rose as each warrior spoke of the charm's power, their voices low, but edged with the heat of pride. Lucius described how the bronze phallus had once turned a sudden ambush into a retreat, the clink of metal echoing through the ranks. Ariston countered with stories of olive leaves, cradling strategic insight, the rustle of leaves in the temple courtyard, a reminder of Athena's whispered counsel. Neferet recalled the scarab's presence at the Nile's banks, the soft sand slipping through her sandals as the eye of Ra seemed to brighten the night. Li Wei, with a patient smile, spoke of the rabbit's subtle wind, the gentle rustle of bamboo, leaves outside the tent, suggesting that even a soft breeze could steer a ship away from danger. The air grew thicker with irony as the fire sputtered, casting shadows that turned the warriors' faces into blurred silhouettes, as if hidden by the very myths they invoked. Lucius, attempting to demonstrate the phallus's vigor, knocked his cup over, spilling amber liquid onto the tablecloth, the scent of wine mingling with the metallic tang of his charm. Ariston's olive leaf slipped from his grasp, landing on the ground with a quiet thud, and a nearby mouse scurried away, indifferent to divine strategy. Neferet's scarab, polished for the tail, caught a stray spark and dimmed, its eye momentarily clouded like a dusk sky. Li Wei's rabbit, when lifted, slipped from his fingers, rolling onto a warm stone, its jade surface cooling the palm that had just held it, a reminder that even the most revered token can be as fragile as a stone warmed by the sun. A hush settled as the crackle of the fire steadied, and the warriors shared a simple meal of barley bread and goat cheese, the crusts softening under their teeth. The clink of wooden bowls and the low murmur of conversation replaced the earlier contest, each hand resting lightly on the cherished token beside their plate. Outside, a night breeze brushed the canvas walls, carrying the faint scent of pine from the distant forest, a sensory echo of Lee Wei's rabbits' promised winds. The firelight painted the bronze, amber, jade, and scarab in muted hues, their colors blending into the terracotta glow of the surroundings. In this quiet exchange, the tokens rested, not as weapons of destiny, but as familiar weights anchoring each man to his heritage. When the embers waned, the four lingered, eyes half closed, feeling the gentle pulse of history that lingered in the air like the lingering warmth of a hearth. Their tokens, now cool and silent, served more as reminders of shared humanity than as guarantors of triumph. A subtle lesson that fate often rests in the ordinary act of keeping one's hands steady. The rustle of the tent canvas, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft click of a distant stirrup created a backdrop to their reflective pause. In the stillness, the narrator sensed a melancholy comfort, a recognition that the desire for luck is as ancient as the stones beneath their feet, yet always accompanied by the quiet acceptance of imperfection. The night deepened, the world outside hushed, and the warriors, each cradling their charm, settled into a calm that felt both timeless and fleeting. On the outer field of the forum, the legionaries gathered beneath a thin veil of morning mist, each clutching a small talisman, an amber amulet, a bronze figural pin, a cedar charm borrowed from distant campaigns. The sand underfoot was cool, the distant sound of a water trough ticking in rhythm with their breathing. They arranged wooden stakes in a simple pattern, mirroring the geometry of an ancient battle formation, while a young scribe noted the weight of each token. The air held the faint aroma of baked bread from a nearby vendor, a reminder of ordinary life beyond the exercise. Voices whispered comments about luck, but the mood remained unhurried, as if the day itself were waiting politely for the first footfall. When the mock skirmish began, the first spear thrust missed its target, the wooden spearhead snapping against the stone and sending a sharp crack across the field, followed by nervous chuckles. The rain that had been gathering on the horizon descended in a sudden, soft patter, slicking the sand and muffling the clatter of armor, while the amber amulet glimmered under droplets like a wounded firefly. A boar, startled by the sudden sounds, barreled through the ranks, its hooves thudding, and sent a few soldiers scrambling, their shields clanking like distant bells. The commanders tried to keep order, eyes flicking to the blurred silhouettes of distant statues, their faces hidden in shadow. The mishaps unfolded slowly, each anomaly a quiet reminder that even the most carefully kept charms could not command the elements. As the rain softened to a drizzle, a veteran soldier raised his bronze pin aloft, declaring it a shield against misfortune. only for a stray splash to splash directly onto his own visor, obscuring his view and eliciting a muted laugh from his peers. The cedar charm, meant to summon courage, trembled in the wind, its scent of pine mixing with the damp earth. Yet the boar, now calm, merely sniffed around the periphery before retreating. The unexpected quiet after the chaos felt oddly theatrical, as if the field itself were sighing, allowing the participants to observe the absurdity of their belief in tiny objects. The observers, half smiling, exchanged glances that spoke of shared patience rather than competitive wrath. In that moment, the line between superstition and camaraderie blurred as gently as the rain-blurred horizon. When the clouds thinned and the sun returned a hesitant golden hue, the soldiers lowered their weapons, the wooden stakes casting long shadows that stretched across the sand like forgotten verses. The talismans were placed back into their leather pouches, each feeling a little heavier from the damp, each whispering the subtle story of the day's trial. A quiet murmur rose among the men, a collective acknowledgement that the charm's power lay less in magical guarantee and more in the shared ritual of holding something together. The scent of warm stone and distant olives filled the air, anchoring the scene in ordinary sensory detail. The field settled into a steady, breathing silence, as steady as the pulse of a sleeping city beyond the walls. Later, as twilight painted the forum in soft terracotta, the legionaries lingered, their shields resting against the soft ground, eyes turning to the dim silhouettes of distant arches. They spoke in low tones about the rain, the boar, the cracked spear, and the way the charms had felt like companions rather than talismans. Each word folding into the next like pages of a well-worn diary. The hidden faces of the city's old statues seemed to watch, their outlines blurred by the encroaching dusk, offering no judgment, only the quiet presence of history. In the lingering cool, they felt a gentle melancholy, recognizing that the real protection came from the steady rhythm of their own breaths and the quiet fellowship among them. The night settled, and the field, now empty, kept the faint imprint of their steps, a subtle reminder that human imperfection and gentle irony walk side by side through time. The sky over the desert plain darkened as a low rumble rolled across the marching columns, and the sudden thunderstorm brushed the sand with a cool spray. A Roman soldier tightened the bronze phallus tied to his belt, feeling its metal warm under the first flash of lightning. Nearby, a Greek hoplite brushed the olive leaf pinned to his cuirass, hearing it tremble in the wind. An Egyptian infantryman rested a scarab amulet against his chest, noting the faint hum that rose with each drop of rain. A jade rabbit token carried by a distant Chinese archer caught the fleeting light, shimmering like a quiet ripple on water. The storm grew louder, drumming on helmets and shields, and the soldiers shuffled forward with a measured tread that made the dust settle into soft swirls. The Roman phallus pulsed with a gentle glow, casting a thin amber circle on the sand, while the Greek olive leaf vibrated like a thin reed. The scarab's hum deepened, resonating through the Egyptian's armor as a low, steady thrum, and the jade rabbit emitted a subtle gleam that softened the surrounding gray. Each charm seemed to respond to the same invisible rhythm, drawing the eyes of the men to one another's talismans. The tension settled into a quiet curiosity, as if the storm had offered a momentary pause for observation. In the shared light, the soldiers caught sight of each other's faces, blurred by the rain and the flickering glow, making their expressions appear both solemn and oddly amused. The convergence of the four charms spun a faint vortex of color above the ground. A thin column of amber, green, gold, and muted blue that hovered like a question mark over their boots. The irony lay in how each culture's private hope had unintentionally woven a common thread, reminding the men that their individual deities were but facets of a larger, indifferent sky. The vortex pulsed once, then steadied, as the wind carried the scent of distant seas and distant temples, mixing with the earthy smell of wet sand. The soldiers, though trained for conquest, found themselves quietly listening to the hush that followed the storm's roar. When the rain softened to a gentle drizzle, the luminous column dimmed, leaving a warm afterglow that lingered on the polished metal of the Roman charm and the polished jade of the rabbit. The men adjusted their straps, feeling the steady patter on their helmets as a soothing metronome. The Greek olive leaf stopped trembling, resting against the soldier's chest like a pressed leaf in a book, while the Egyptian scarab's hum faded to a barely audible vibration. In the calm that settled, they stood shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms creasing in the same pattern of wear, their steps sinking to the same slow cadence. The storm moved onward, leaving the plain quiet, and the soldiers resumed their march with a measured, unhurried stride. Later, as the sun slipped behind distant dunes, the men glanced at the charms still dimly lit, each a reminder of the fragile hope they carried. Their thoughts lingered on how a simple weather shift had revealed a shared reliance on small objects rather than grand triumphs. The blurred faces of their commanders, hidden in shadow, seemed less important than the steady breath of the desert wind that brushed their skins. In the hush of evening, the soldiers understood that the durability of their journeys lay not in the favor of any single god, but in the quiet perseverance of ordinary hands and humble tokens. The night settled in, and the story of the storm became another faint layer in the long, patient tapestry of human striving. In the early light of a dusty camp, Roman legionaries polished their bronze talismans, while distant Sogdian horsemen polished amber pendants, each object catching the pale sunrise as if to catch hope itself. The air smelled of cracked leather and river mud, and the low murmur of soldiers arranging their gear resembled a slow tide. Scholars from Alexandria folded papyrus scrolls beside the fire, their quills tracing the outlines of these charms with quiet curiosity. A gentle wind fluttered the banners of the Carthaginian auxiliary, revealing the faint glint of copper amulets tucked into the seams of their cloaks. The scene unfolded with the deliberate rhythm of a camera pan, inviting the viewer to linger on each ordinary detail. No grand proclamation rose, only a soft acknowledgement that every culture clutched some token against uncertainty. When the sky thickened into a bruise-colored storm, the camp's rhythm faltered, and the clang of metal against shield grew louder, echoing against stone walls. Soldiers tightened the cords of their luck charms, feeling the cool weight of iron against their palms as rain drummed on the thatched roofs. The distant drum of a Macedonian phalanx marched under a veil of mist, its leather straps damp and heavy, while the heat of a nearby fire fought a losing battle with the chill. A scholar's candle sputtered, casting trembling shadows that slipped over the blurred faces of distant oracles, hidden in the gloom. Tension lingered in the scent of wet earth and the rustle of dried leaves, each breath a reminder of the precarious line between confidence and fear. Yet within that pressure, the small ritual of polishing a charm seemed to steady trembling hands, if only for a moment. As the storm waned, a sudden gust sent a Roman talisman slipping from a soldier's grip, landing clumsily into the mud, where it sparked a brief, absurd chuckle among the weary ranks. The Sogdian horsemen, noticing the mishap, offered a freshly polished amber piece to the embarrassed legionary, their smiles as muted as the soft patter of lingering drops. The exchange sparked a low murmur of laughter that rose like steam from a kettle, an unplanned theater of shared humanity. Even the stern Carthaginian commander, whose helm was scarred with battle, bent to tie a simple rope not around his own charm, his eyes reflecting a sleepy amusement. The irony lay in the fact that the very objects meant to shield against chaos had become catalysts for a gentle, collective sigh of relief. In that brief interlude, the sound of distant hooves and the scent of wet wool blended into a quiet tableau of camaraderie. When the clouds finally thinned, pale sunlight brushed the camp's worn wooden tables, and the soldiers gathered around a communal bowl of lentil soup, its warmth rising like a soft sigh. They passed the talismans between them, each hand feeling the familiar coolness, while the scholars exchanged notes on the similar symbols etched into each culture's history. The crackling fire painted amber flickers on tired faces, their expressions relaxed, their eyes half closed, as if the day itself were settling into a nap. The scent of smoked meat mingled with the lingering rain, creating a comforting backdrop to the low conversations about home villages and distant battles. A quiet rhythm returned. The clink of metal, the rustle of parchment, the occasional chuckle, all subdued under the serene canopy of an evening sky. In this calm, the notion of luck seemed less a weapon and more a shared blanket, gently draped over each weary figure. Later, as night settled like a soft quilt, the camp illuminated by a handful of oil lamps, the soldiers and scholars reflected on the day's intertwined stories, feeling a muted respect settle in their chests. The worn leather of a Roman sandal brushed against a Sogdian cloth, a subtle reminder that disparate paths had briefly converged under the same stars. Their charms rested on a low wooden crate, each one a small testament to hopes whispered in different tongues, but understood in the same breath. The faint scent of incense curled upward, its smoke mingling with the cool night air, while the distant hills whispered a quiet lullaby to the sleeping ground. In the stillness, a gentle melancholy lingered, recognizing that while wars would rise again, the shared gesture of clutching a token of luck would endure as a quiet legacy. The night held them together, not through grand victories, but through the ordinary act of holding onto something small, warm, and familiar.